Have our fascinating tales of everyday people from the past inspired you to explore your own family story? This episode is brought to you by findmypast.co.uk, the perfect place to start building your family tree for free. It makes it so easy to get started with just a few details and helps you fill in the gaps from there. Their smart hints do the hard work for you, instantly unearthing clues to your past from their vast record collections. You can search other members' family trees to make new connections and even share your discoveries with loved ones as your family tree grows. In just a few minutes, you'll have a flourishing family tree full of incredible stories and revelations. Visit findmypast.co.uk/journeythroughtime to start your family tree with a free trial. That's findmypast.co.uk/journeythroughtime. Free trial auto renews after 7 days unless canceled. Terms and conditions apply.
Working men. Shall Americans or English rule in this city? The crew of the British steamer have threatened all Americans who shall dare to express their opinions this night at the English aristocratic Opera House. We advocate no violence, but a free expression of opinion to all public men. Working men, free men, stand by your lawful rights. Signed, the American Committee. Those were the words printed on handbills, leaflets that were handed out and pasted onto walls in New York City on May the 9th, 1849, urging working-class New York men to descend upon the Astor Place Opera House and fight for their rights. The result was the deadliest riot to take place in the United States in the years before the Civil War, and it was all about a performance of Shakespeare. I'm David Olusoga. Welcome to Journey Through Time.
I'm Sarah Churchwell. And yes, David, this week we're looking at the night that a performance of Macbeth took the idea of culture wars from a metaphor to a deadly reality. The Astor Place riot, which is sometimes known as the Shakespeare riot, was the deadliest use of military force against American civilians in peacetime up to that point. And it turned around a theater, as we will hear, around a performance of Shakespeare. But of course, there were underlying causes. Everybody loves Shakespeare, but there were probably other contributing factors. And like a lot of the urban unrest at that time, it turned on some kind of combustible forces that were very present in American life then as now. It was about immigration. It was about nativists who were opposed to certain immigrant groups. And those immigrants and nativists, they were often opposed, but sometimes they were working side by side when they had a common enemy. And they were both often united in rage against the city's elite, because New York at that time was a city of haves and have-nots.
So immigration, class, poverty, combustible, as you say.
Yeah, and familiar, right? So the outcomes may be a little bit different, but the underlying forces are very, very familiar. So let's just set the stage for 1849, cast our minds back, a little bit of stage setting. We're going to have a lot of metaphors about the stage here, I think. So the not very well remembered President Zachary Taylor was in the White House. And of course, Victoria and Albert are on the British throne. Our story today takes place just 2 years before the Great Exhibition, the Empire's great pageant of progress that we discussed a few weeks ago. But now we're on the other side of the Atlantic.
And this is 1849, so it is a period where across the world, particularly in Europe, there's been lots of riots, lots of violence, because the previous year, 1848, was the year of revolutions in Europe.
And in America, the fight at that point isn't over rewriting constitutions or getting rid of monarchs, but it's over culture and identity. It's over who gets to define the nation, because in the United States, partly as a result of that unrest in Europe, there have been waves of immigration coming into the U.S. and changing the face of American society. And a lot of the locus of that energy was New York City.
New York City is becoming a megacity by the 1840s.
It's the fastest growing city in the Western Hemisphere. It's big, it's loud, it's crowded. Between 1820 and 1860, over 5 million immigrants arrived in the U.S., and nearly half of those came through New York Harbor, and many of them stayed in New York. And as we said, New York at that point very rapidly becomes a city of haves and have-nots. There's massive wealth disparity.
New York's population is around 700,000 by this point, but the whole American population has just incredibly increased in the first half of the 19th century. It's gone from about 5 million at the beginning of the century to 23 million by the time we get to the 1840s, 1850s. It's about the same as Britain and Ireland. The former colony is now as populous as the former imperial master.
Yeah. And this is a lot of change for any society to grapple with. America had been a fairly insular colony, and suddenly it's growing and people are having to reckon with the changes that creates. And in particular, in this period of time, the Irish are arriving in the United States in droves. They're fleeing famine and they're arriving without any money. They are desperate and they're Catholic.
1847 had been the very worst year of the Great Famine, the Black 47, as it's called. In 1848, there had been the Young Ireland Rebellion that had been crushed by the British. People were not just leaving because they had no food, they were leaving because they were being evicted from their land. And as you say, New York Harbor is where many of these ships carrying thousands of these desperate, often very, very young Irish migrants, disproportionately male, that's where they're arriving, and it's often where they're settling.
Yeah, it was a disproportionate number of Irish. So Irish immigrants made up nearly half of all the foreign-born people in the United States at this time. And many of them were settling in eastern cities, New York, Boston. My hometown of Chicago, they were also making their way there soon. But at this point, they're really settling in New York. And as we've said, they're impoverished. They're mostly rural. They're mostly devoutly Catholic. And that is at odds with the pre-existing makeup of American society, which was largely Protestant and largely Anglo-American. So Protestant elites are watching with a lot of anxiety and nerves as Catholic churches multiply and as Irish gangs, particularly in New York City, as they form. And anti-Catholic sentiment exploded in the U.S. at this time. There was huge anti-Catholic conspiracies. There were all kinds of rumors that the Pope was trying to infiltrate American society. And a lot of Americans at the time saw Catholicism as incompatible with democracy because they thought Catholics would have a higher loyalty to the Pope rather than to the American Constitution. So conspiracy theories spread that priests were pulling puppet strings and that immigrants were, in the service of foreign plots, and all of these kinds of anti-Catholic propaganda starts to spread. So that's part of the background that you have to understand how the Shakespeare riots could come to take place. Because at the same time in the US, anti-British sentiment is high. Now, we're used to, thinking about the special relationship and to Britain and America being historic friends and allies, but that was not the case in the first half of the 19th century. It isn't even a century since the U.S. fought its revolution. And of course, in between, there was another war, which people today sometimes forget about.
It is very often forgotten about.
Certainly in Britain, it is.
It is one of the many wars that seems to have been slightly airbrushed out of history on this side of the Atlantic, but very much not in the US.
Yeah, we have a memory of it because you burned down the White House. So.
Yeah, it's hard to forget that this is, of course, the War of 1812.
In the War of 1812, David, I'm not going to hold you personally responsible for this, but your side did invade my side. So the British invaded North America. It was a fight over British trade restrictions, but it was also a fight about U.S. sovereignty because America was still trying to establish really its full independence. It had legal and political independence, but how did that work in practice? And yeah, as I've just alluded to, it ended with you guys coming and burning down the White House. And it is possible that there's still some lingering annoyance about that.
Yeah, a British force landed in Washington, burnt down the White House, burnt the books in the Library of Congress. It's not surprising that has not been entirely forgotten.
Yeah, it pissed us off a little bit, the Americans obviously were contributors to the War of 1812. It was a war. But anyway, we were not happy about the burning of the White House. So, and the point, of course, is that anti-British feeling, it wasn't like it had gone away after the revolution and then the War of 1812 suddenly recreated it. It had persisted, of course. So in fact, the War of 1812 only deepened it. So we need to really flip our presumptions and expectations about what we think the Anglo-American relations are like at this time. It's tense. It's not very friendly on both sides, really, a lot of the time. The other key thing that I think really has dropped out from popular memory is that many Americans believed across the 19th century, well into the 20th century, they really deeply believed that Britain was planning to reconquer the US. Like there were these constant conspiracy theories that the British were coming and that you guys wanted us back. That might be by force, but often it might be by subversion, like infiltration. And so there, well into the 1920s, there are big stories about plots. There's a big one about trying to reclaim Chicago. Actually, there was a whole conspiracy theory in the 20s that the British were trying to like win over Chicagoans by planting pro-British propaganda in the public schools. It's one of my favorites. So these kinds of sentiments are, in the air. They're in the atmosphere. And at the same time, of course, there are these hundreds of thousands of Irish immigrants who are fleeing Ireland because they are fleeing the consequences of British occupation. And we talked about this in the Black Tom episode, right? That feeling of anti-British sentiment on the part of the Irish population of America is a factor in a lot of the way American history unfolds in this period. So in other words, for a lot of people in the United States at this time, the English weren't just foreigners. They were the enemy. They were the opponent. And that, again, is really crucial to the way the Shakespeare riots unfold.
And this is one of the few things that both the Irish migrant community and indigenous native Americans can agree on, is that none of them are fond of the British. And I think it's important to remember just what a global failure Britain's response to the Great Famine was regarded as. This was, in newspapers across the world, seen as not just a political failure, but a sort of ideological decision to not save the Irish people, to allow this famine to ravage the population of Ireland in the way that famines taking place at the same time in other countries for the same reason led to nothing like, no comparable death toll.
So yeah, and people have reasons for being angry, as you say. And so all of these tensions in the US are crystallizing into a movement that becomes known as nativism. Now, this is a familiar word to listeners, but it's worth saying this is the moment when that word is coined. It's coined in the U.S. in this context. And it's the way that the so-called American Party, they called themselves Native Americans, but of course they didn't mean indigenous people. They meant native-born Americans. And they call themselves nativists. And part of nativism wasn't just saying that there are too many immigrants. It was claiming that native-born Americans were superior to the immigrant communities that were coming in. And this is crucial. So it's part of the long and, inglorious history of broadly scientific racism, the idea that certain, human ethnic groups are inherently superior to others, that they're more civilized than the newcomers who are coming in. So this isn't just about immigration policy. This is about cultural supremacy.
And the 1840s, to add another element to this combustible mix, is also, as you say, it's one of the periods in which scientific racism is really developing. And it's not just about skin color, that one of the questions is, are the Irish a lower race than people from England or people of English descent? So race doesn't quite mean what we think it does today. And there are lots and lots of really disturbing theories about the Irish. Some of them put forward by Robert Knox, who we discussed in the Burke and Hare episodes a couple of weeks ago, just to bring back my hatred of Robert Knox. Because I was going to say your favorite,
your absolute favorite Robert Knox. Yeah. Let's bring him in to revile him whenever we can. I'm on board with that. Yeah. It's a really complicated history, and it's one that I'm sure we'll get into in lots of the stories that we tell. But as you say, there's this kind of mingling of racial and ethnic attitudes at the time that people need to be aware of. And as I say, they nativists at this time refer to their platform as Americanism. And actually, just a few years after this, one of the Native American Party politicians in New York said in a speech, "I go for America first, last, and always." And this is something, as you know, that I've spent some time researching, David. And as far as I can tell, this is actually the earliest use of America first as a political slogan. And it was in this context, much, much earlier than most people think it was. It's the 1850s, and it's the growth of the original nativist movement. So for listeners, think America first, because that is how people are responding to these waves of immigration. But it's 170 years ago.
And this sentiment is mobilized within this thing called the American Party.
So they have different names. They call themselves the American Party, the Native American Party. They also were known as the Know Nothings, which it sounds funny to listeners today because it sounds like it was a slam against them. It was actually their own name for themselves, not because they were ignorant, but because they were secretive. So that you would say, I know nothing. I have not heard about this party. I don't know anything.
So when they were arrested, they'd say, I don't know anything. I know nothing.
I know nothing. Yeah. So it's a pledge of secrecy. So they have all these different names, but they are basically America First, and America First meant then what it means now. It's about nativism, economic protectionism. It's pro-tariff. It's all sorts of things that we would recognize today.
It's being born in America, being white, being Anglo-Saxon as opposed to Irish. That's what they mean by native.
Exactly. So not our thinking around indigenous people. They mean native born, and they mean the older British settler communities in America, Protestant, Anglo-Saxon, native born, and hostile to a lot of these population groups that are coming in. And as you said earlier, David, and this is really important, the nativists obviously hate the Irish for the reasons we've just said, but they both hate the British. And so they could unite over a common enemy, and that's what happens in the story. So this is the context. This is a city that is built by immigration, and the tensions are building through rage and fear, and the stage is being set for a showdown. As I said, we're going to have a lot of stages set metaphors because that's kind of what happened. Now, before we get to the Astor Place riots, there's a lot of context that needs to be understood, because since it's a proxy war, you can't understand why people battled to the death over Shakespeare unless you actually understand the underlying causes. So it's worth also saying that, because the idea of a riot over Shakespeare sounds totally bizarre to modern ears, but theater riots were not unknown in the United States at this time, and especially when British actors took the stage for all of the reasons that we're saying. So back in 1765, before the American Revolution, a New York playhouse was torn apart during the protests that helped lead to the revolution. This was a protest over the Stamp Act. Stages could become lightning rods. So anti-British fury could turn physical when you had an actual, emblem of it in front of you.
So British actors on stage was sometimes the spark that would ignite a riot.
Yeah. And between 1816 and 1834, according to the Shakespeare scholar James Shapiro, there were 29 theater-related riots in New York City. 29 theater-related riots in less than a 20-year period, 1816 to 1834. And Shapiro notes, to your point, David, that riots require crowds. And theaters in dense urban areas could hold thousands of spectators. And in a more diffuse population, there weren't necessarily that many conditions where there were thousands of spectators, but theaters were one of them.
Yeah, this is one of the few places where people come together. And I guess we also have to get out of our mind what theaters later become. This is not rows of red velvet seats. These are big spaces with wooden benches with as many people packed in as possible. And so you get a kind of crowd density that you kind of don't get in today's theaters.
And classes mingling, right? And this is actually a really important part of the story of the Astor Place riot, because as we will see, one of the flashpoints was the effort to turn theaters into the structure that we recognize today. But yes, we have to understand theater as a place of a democratic space where everybody gets to come. It's affordable. Everybody likes it. They feel entitled to be there. And so again, it can become flashpoints when all of these groups come together.
So it's not just large crowds, it's crowds that involve everybody. It's one of the few spaces that is not stratified, where middle-class people live in middle-class areas, they go to middle-class restaurants, but theater, working-class people and middle-class people and even the elite people all gather together.
That's right. And people felt very entitled to that space, and they resented any efforts to push them out of it. Now, it's worth mentioning, I think, a couple of the other theater riots that predate the Astor Place riot, because we'll see, again, some of these recurring themes. So there was the African Grove riot of 1823, which is when a black theater was destroyed by a white mob. And there it's, I think, much clearer to modern listeners how that's obviously a proxy battle for different kinds of tensions. That's obviously an outbreak over racial tension, but plays out through a theater. And in 1834, the so-called Farron riots were also sparked in a theater. And again, this one was over racial tensions. Anti-abolitionist mobs, so pro-slavery mobs, rampaged for days throughout New York, destroying black homes, churches, neighborhoods. So racial tensions come to a boiling point through a lot of these theater riots as well. So basically, there is a history of this. The Astor Place riots doesn't come out of nowhere, but it is the largest and the deadliest of the pre-Civil War riots. And it happened in 1849 at the Astor Place Opera House.
So tell me about the Opera House. Why was that the place where this terrible riot took place?
The Astor Place Opera House had just been built. It had been built in 1847. And it is exactly a response to the conditions that we were just talking about. The theaters had always been this place where, as you said, class stratification was kind of put to one side and everybody could come in and mingle. But the elite didn't always like having to mingle with the people that they considered their inferiors. And so some wealthy New Yorkers built the Astor Place Opera House, and they set rules. So it had a dress code where men had to wear expensive white kid gloves, in order to be admitted. And it started to have that kind of velvet rope division that you were talking about, David, where there were different sections that were set off for more expensive seats and less expensive seats. I'm going to keep using the word proxy because that's really how this story plays out. It was clear that all of these efforts, like saying you have to wear white kid gloves, well, that's just a way of saying only the rich may enter, right?
I was reading the dress code, and it said that men had to be cleanly shaven. They had to have waistcoats. And as you said, kid gloves, which are gloves made of goat skin, very fine gloves, not the sort of thing you're going to have if you're an Irish migrant just off the boat from Cork or Dublin, not the sort of thing you're going to have if you're a poor Protestant New Yorker who works in construction or works on the docks. As you say, high ticket prices, dress codes, what they're really about is saying this is for some people and not for others.
Exactly. It isn't just that the theater is a place where people can mingle. It's mass culture. Remember, you don't have television. You don't have film. But you still have a society where many people can't read fluently, especially the immigrant working class. Many of them are learning English as a second language. This is the go-to entertainment. You can go to theater like you can watch TV today, or indeed go watch a sports game in a small town. So they aren't just stages. This isn't just about seeing a play. These are gathering places. These are social hubs. And it is a place where you have your tribal loyalties in a time before professional sports. So people had these very strong sense of allegiances to their champion. So who is your favorite? And they would fight for them. So it was rowdy. It was tribal. Theaters functioned when they worked well as a place, therefore, to let people blow off steam. So they could work as a safety valve, but sometimes the steam exploded, as it will in those situations when it isn't working as a safety valve and the anger comes to a head.
So the function of theatre was, as you say, what sport is today. It's a place where you go and you don't watch passively. You don't quietly applaud. It's very different to going to a theatre now. It is a place where you can shout. The audience is part of the event. It's really, really interactive. And I think it is really interesting to think that a lot of that now has transferred to sport. In the 1840s, most of the great American sports have not yet emerged. Baseball's just beginning. Basketball hasn't been invented. American football is going to emerge later in the universities. The big sports are horse racing and bare knuckle boxing. And there's basically not enough sport to allow people to have spaces where they can shout, where they can be participatory, where they can express themselves. And because you haven't got enough sport, you haven't got enough sporting heroes. So actors, in some ways, take the place of the way sporting heroes, great athletes do today. They're the people that you get behind. You have your favorites, and you have the people you also don't like.
That's precisely right. And so it's a mix of kind of sporting event energy and also a bit of rock star energy, right? Because we can also think like Taylor Swift's fans, right? These are diehard fans. They're devoted. And as you say, they want to take part.
But the strange thing about all this, Sarah, that is it's about Shakespeare. That's the really hard thing to get your head around, that people are getting this angry or this euphoric about Shakespeare.
But again, this is exactly the point. Shakespeare, too, was mass culture in America. So part of the story of the Astor Place riots is about how Shakespeare becomes only for the elite. Because at this point in time in the United States, Shakespeare was everywhere. Everyone knew it. It was quoted in sermons. It was in newspapers. It was recited on street corners. Everybody knew Shakespeare. And the reason for that is simple, actually. There was a book called The McGuffey Reader, and The McGuffey Reader was a textbook. It was the most widely used textbook in 19th century America, and it was particularly used in the little kind of classic one-room schoolhouses in a frontier town, because it was one book that graduated for all ages of readers. And you basically learn to read through it. It's a primer, and you basically learn to read through it. And the majority of American school children learn to read from the so-called McGuffey reader, and it included a lot of Shakespeare. It had long excerpts from Julius Caesar, from Henry V, from Hamlet, and students memorized passages to recite. It's how they learned to read. So by the mid-1800s, literally millions of American children had learned to read via Renaissance English, Shakespeare, and the King James Bible. In many homes, those would be, if they had any bound books, those would be the only bound books that they had, would be the complete works of Shakespeare and the Bible. So Shakespeare's words are woven into everyday American life. Everybody understood it. It is pop culture.
I was reading that when Alexis de Tocqueville does his famous tour of America in the 1830s, that's something that really, really strikes him, that he goes to frontier towns, he goes to small villages, and everyone knows Shakespeare, that Shakespeare is being recited around campfires out in the countryside. And this French visitor is amazed by the ubiquity of Shakespeare in America in the 1830s, just a decade before the Astor Place riot.
Listeners who know Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn will be familiar with exactly what you're talking about, David, because he satirizes this in the figures of the con men, the Duke and the Dauphin, who are pretending to be European aristocrats, but they also pretend to be Shakespearean actors, and they butcher Shakespeare on stage. But so it's part of Twain's running comedy throughout Huckleberry Finn is that these characters who don't really know Shakespeare, and they're mangling it constantly. But even in these backwoods towns in the Deep South, in the pre-Civil War era, people are paying to see these guys play Shakespeare. And Twain is banking on an audience that knew Shakespeare well enough that they would find these mangled gibberish versions that the Duke and Dauphin quote, that they would find that hilarious.
Parody can only work if you understand what it's supposed to be like. So it's only funny if you know Shakespeare.
So all of this means Shakespeare is pop culture, right? And then in 1849, it all comes to a head as two of the biggest Shakespearean actors actually go literally head to head in rival productions of Macbeth.
Well, let's take a break there. And then when we come back, let's meet these two actors whose rivalry, whose personal enmity is going to be the root cause of the Astor Place riots. This part of the show is brought to you by family history website Find My Past, the home of British and Irish family stories.
And as part of their Her Story campaign, which works to highlight the overlooked and undervalued achievements of women throughout history, we've been digging into some remarkable stories of women whose wartime contributions were recorded and remembered in the 1939 register on Find My Past.
In 1939, a fruit farm in Kent was run entirely by women. 12 of them, living and working under a single roof. And at the centre was a widow, farmer Kathleen Fairweather, who was joined by her daughter, sisters, and extended family.
Most of them joined the Women's Land Army, and that formalized their work on the farm so that they could gain uniforms, rations, and the legal right to stay on the land they were working. And this whole kind of extraordinary scene comes to life thanks to Find My Past records. It's a snapshot of one farm frozen in time in 1939 with women standing on it.
What started with a household in the 1939 register led to a deeper story. Through Find My Past, we uncovered not just names, but family ties, jobs, roles, and a forgotten history of women behind the front line during the Second World War. And this family story is part of a much, much bigger story, Sarah.
Well, it absolutely is. And, you talk there about being behind the front line. And of course, the home front is often talked about in those terms. But in another sense, it was very much the front line, particularly in Britain. So the boundary between the front line and the home front blurred a great deal.
I think we sometimes forget that at the heart of strategies for surviving the Second World War in Britain and other countries is the issue of food. The nation was deeply aware that Britain could risk shortages. It could risk malnutrition. And so the land had to be mobilized. And if you mobilize men through conscription to join the army, it's a logical move to do what had happened in the First World War, which was to mobilize women. And the land army, I think we should not underestimate the army part of this. This was a way women were able to in some ways go to war in a war about food production. There's a poster I've always loved from the Second World War, and it shows a woman in the land army with a spade. And behind her is the sort of shadow, almost like the ghostly figure of a British soldier with a Lee Enfield rifle. And It says, we have to get behind the girl that he left behind. And he is the soldier. And in some ways, his rifle and her spade, they're both depicted as weapons in this poster, that they're both at war. They're both fighting for their country. But these are the roles that they've been allotted. And it's an appeal to recognize these women as a kind of force, as part of the war effort, and not to sort of think of this only as a war that takes place on the front line and only as a war that involves men.
And it's interesting, that imagery that you invoke is the woman or the girl that, that he left behind. And yet, as you say, the image itself is she's in the foreground and he's become a shadow behind her. So she's the actual figure. So she's not left behind. She's there doing the work.
Yeah. The army in the land army is, it's not a euphemism. People were not hungry in Britain in the Second World War, and it's these women, to a large part, who are behind that. That was our fascinating find from Find My Past's archives. But we want to hear yours. How have their records helped you understand the stories in your family tree?
Start your journey by exploring the 1939 Register and a vast archive of other records and newspapers with a 7-day free trial at findmypast.co.uk and email us at journeythroughtime@goalhanger.com for a chance to have your discovery featured on next month's podcast.
Welcome back. Sarah, tell me about the two actors whose personal rivalry is the root cause of the Astor Place riot.
So this is a story in which an American actor and a British actor are going head to head. So I'm afraid some national stereotypes come into this in both directions.
That's what I was hoping.
I don't know how you're going to feel about it, David, but the British actor, William McCready, you'll be amazed to hear, he's polished, he's precise, he's refined, he's restrained, he's aristocratic.
He's from an old British acting family, and he is a kind of great Shakespearean figure on the British stage.
And it's worth saying his personal politics are not aristocratic. He was actually a Republican in his own politics. But yes, so he symbolizes aristocracy and the sense of elite culture. And then we have on the other side of the ring, our other gladiator is Edwin Forrest, known as Ned Forrest. And he's America's first big star. And he is also very stereotypical of his culture. He is loud. He is kind of swaggering. He's very physical in the way that he performs, and he's kind of defiant.
He's a big star in another way as well, because he is actually physically very big. Lots of the reviews describe his muscles and his kind of strength. He is a kind of physical actor.
Yeah. And so their two styles are going head to head, right? So McCready is this more psychological, cerebral actor who's very restrained in his performances. And Forrest is all over the place. He's letting it all hang out. As you say, he's a big bruiser. So they really are these very two different styles of performance, of people, and of the kind of identities that they symbolize. It's two visions of culture. It's old world versus new.
Who would they be today if it was modern actors? Who would this rivalry be?
That's a really good question. I mean, the only modern analogy that I've been able to come up with is not actually actors, but the singers Drake and Kendrick Lamar. That's what it feels like to me, is these two, because this personal animosity is spilling out into their performances and into the loyalties of their fans. But I don't know, David, are there actors that you can think of who apply?
You said go for national stereotypes.
Yeah, do.
I'm imagining Ned Forrest as Sylvester Stallone. and William McCready as Daniel Day-Lewis. Maybe I'm trying to make the British come out better in this,
exactly. You rigged that game, David.
Yeah.
Can our actor be a good actor?
I think it's Stallone versus Daniel Day-Lewis.
Well, actually, Forrest was not seen as a great actor by a lot of his critics. In fact, one critic said if a bull could act, he would act like Forrest. So maybe it is Stallone. Okay, so you're right. Okay, so I'll give you that. So Stallone and Day-Lewis are going head to head in their interpretations of the Bard. And
I'd love to see that.
I don't think I would actually, but maybe. And it isn't just the two of them. Columns are filled with everybody gets caught up in this battle over who does Shakespeare better. What kind of performances should we be seeing? Is it this kind of psychological, cerebral, restrained style that McCready embodies? Or is it this big, bombastic, loud, chest-thumping version that Forrest prefers?
So two actors, two nations, two interpretations of Shakespeare at odds, and clashing with one another.
And then what we have to do is recognize that those cultural tensions get superimposed onto the cultural tensions that pre-exist within New York, because McCready's associations with the aristocracy mean that he's associated with the American aristocracy, with elite Americans. He plays for New York's upper 10. He plays for that kid-gloved crowd that we were talking about. So he is their darling, and Forrest is the darling of the working man.
And we should say that in America of the 1840s, the idea of aristocracy is the idea of everything that the revolution had been about: to escape the British elite, to escape the power of royalty, the power of the English and British elites. And the great fear of early America is that America will have its own elite, its own aristocracy will emerge. So being English is almost, a sort of code for being in favor of aristocracy. Aristocracy is a word of abuse here in this context, isn't it?
It is. We've been talking about the class associations, but there are very clearly national associations here. And Forrest is a nationalist figure. He's flag waving. He's patriotic. He says this is American Shakespeare. This is the way that we're supposed to do it. He's basically, like yelling Murica, but in blank verse, right?
So Murica is...
Murica.
Yeah. It's a bit like the way Trump says America.
Exactly. So we can make these analogies, right? Because Forrest's fan base is a lot like a MAGA fan base. It's populist. They're rallying around somebody who's punching back against the perceived elite order that you're talking about, David. They're anti-elite. They're anti-abolitionist. So their racial politics are also, aligning more with the MAGA side of things. And they are fiercely nationalist. So basically the culture wars that we recognize from today are very, very similar here. They're obviously not identical, but they're very, very similar. The underlying structure is pretty consistent. This is the culture wars, but here it's, dressed in doublets and hose and it's reciting Shakespeare.
So Edwin Forrest is the hero of a nativist, deeply patriotic vision of working class America. But McCready has his supporters in America as well, because there is another America emerging, particularly in New York, around wealth, around the separation of the wealthy from the poor.
And this is exactly the people who have built the Astor Place Opera House in 1847 in order to put velvet ropes around it and to invite people like McCready to come perform for them and to not leave everyone else out, to actively exclude everyone else.
And another comparison we can make between then and now, the 1840s and the 2020s, is inequality. There is a growing elite. We today call them the 1%, but there is a term from them in the 1840s, isn't there?
Yeah, they were known in New York as the upper 10, the upper 10,000. So, as you say, it's the same idea that there is a small concentration of the wealthy, aristocratic elite, and everybody else is not just excluded from that, but they are living in really serious poverty in many cases. So, as you say, it's a very similar idea to today, where there is growing resentment about the idea that there is a very small percentage of people who amass most of the wealth and everybody else is being left behind. And Ned Forrest very much becomes the champion of those who feel left behind. Now, there's also a political dimension to this that we have to recognize too, because it plays into what happens. Because Forrest's supporters include parts of the New York political machinery, which at the time was known as Tammany Hall. And Tammany Hall was a kind of byword for political corruption, for machine politics, for wielding power through patronage, through, kind of saloon networks, and then muscle on the streets, right? So these are political enforcers who mobilize street gangs and immigrant voters to secure elections, often in corrupt ways. So Forrest supporters are all Tammany Hall guys, but a new mayor in New York has just been elected who is trying to fight Tammany Hall. And so political conflict is brewing locally as well. So now entering into that toxic brew of tensions that we've been talking about come McCready and Forrest, who by 1849 have known each other for years, and they have been in professional competition with each other for a long time. They actually started out as friends, but it's all gone south. They've gotten increasingly angry at each other. And as I say, I really see them as kind of the Drake and Kendrick Lamar of their day because the animosity is real. They are having,
it's real.
They're having real fights, dueling in verse with these, fiercely partisan fans behind them.
Even if these tensions had not been there, I mean, there's a great story here of these two guys who were both Shakespearean actors who really, really come to dislike each other. But they had, as you said, started out as friends.
Yeah, but they get caught in this really petty transatlantic feud. So there are different accounts of how it began, but basically they start watching each other's performances. And we were saying how audiences make their displeasure known. But in this case, these are competing actors who are watching each other's performances and booing and hissing at each other. So Forrest goes to see McCready in Edinburgh and hisses McCready's performance of Hamlet. This was back in 1846. But Forrest claimed that he did this because McCready had sabotaged his London tour. So basically, when the crowds didn't like Forrest blamed McCready and said, oh, he's been poisoning the crowds against me in London. Although at least some scholars, like Jim Shapiro, the Shakespeare scholar we mentioned, says, maybe they just didn't like Forrest's acting style and maybe McCready had nothing to do with it. But Forrest blamed McCready, and then McCready, aristocratic McCready, retaliates by calling Forrest unfit for Shakespeare. And then Forrest calls McCready, I love this, a superannuated driveler. So, he may have been Sylvester Stallone, but he could turn a phrase. I mean, superannuated driveler is pretty good. I'm going to remember that the next time somebody pisses me off.
And they'd gone back and forth. Forrest had gone to Britain and toured up London and played around the country. And McCready had toured in America. So they got to know each other by crossing the Atlantic. And that's where their rivalry their animosity had really developed.
And what Forrest starts doing is really goading McCready because he starts booking the same performances that McCready is in. Forrest will find another theater across town and play exactly the same part on exactly the same night. So he creates a complete head-to-head rivalry. So you have to choose, if you want to see Hamlet, are you going to see McCready's Hamlet or are you going to see Forrest's Hamlet because they're playing on the same night in the same city? And Forrest would travel around dogging McCready's footsteps.
I mean, that is really petty.
Yeah, they were really. So McCready sued at one point. I mean, it's all very silly until it isn't, right?
We should also say here that both the British press and later the American press love this. They all are selling newspapers and they are actually kind of winding these two guys up. They're making this rivalry more intense. They're drawing in all of these political forces, the forces of nationalism, because it sells newspapers. And, this is a story in which the press on both sides of the Atlantic come out of it really badly.
Yeah, they absolutely play into it. And there are sort of larger questions. We're talking about the pettiness of it, but what they're really getting at, certainly by the time McCready comes to the US and he and Forrest are going head to head in America, is really what is American art supposed to be? And this is a really big question for Americans across the 19th century as we try to establish a kind of autonomous American culture that isn't just an offshoot of British culture. The question is, should American art ape the British? Should it try to be more McCready? Or should we be authentically American? Should we find somebody like Forrest who makes it sound American? So this is really part of a long struggle about the efforts to find a kind of, as I say, kind of authentic American culture.
But what it definitely doesn't involve, finding this authentic American artistic voice, is actors, British actors like McCready, very studied, very highly respected by American elites, coming to New York and telling Americans how to perform Shakespeare. You can see how these tensions are part of America finding its cultural voice.
And that's what happens in 1849. McCready decides that he's going to have a farewell tour of America, but all of this stuff has been building up. And so Forrest fans and the people who are opposed to McCready, they really don't like him and they are ready to make their displeasure known. Early on in this tour, and Forrest doesn't have anything to do with this particular moment per se, but early on in his tour, McCready was already so reviled by American audiences that someone hurled half a sheep carcass at him mid-performance. I mean, rotten fruit is one thing. This is
more than just, I was about to say.
Exactly. A rotten apple on your head, sounds pretty grim, actually, but half a sheep carcass. I mean,
that's quite some hurling. Upper body strength.
Yeah, exactly. You're right. Strong person. But it gives an indication of the kind, when we say rowdy, we mean rowdy, right? And as we said, Forrest has been goading him across his U.S. tour he travels to Philadelphia and books a theater in the same city, and he's traveling around. And so it's building and building and building. And then in May 1849, both men are set to play Macbeth in New York.
And it's critical that it's New York because this is the city where the tensions are at their strongest, where dislike of the British, opposition to the idea of aristocracy, and the divisions between rich and poor are at their most stark. So if this is going to kick off anywhere, it's going to be New York.
And the geographical proximity of these two groups in New York also means that this clash is, even more likely because the theaters that they're playing here are symbolic in the ways that we've been talking about of working class and upper class. But the Astor Place Opera House, which had just been built, as we said, a couple of years earlier, is actually right near the Bowery. So Astor Place is still there in New York. If anybody wants to go check it out, it's right by Washington Square Park. And that is about to come into the story, and right near where NYU now is. And it's just a few blocks north of the Bowery.
A lot of people will have heard of the Bowery, but it has a very, very specific role in the history of New York. This is a very specific neighborhood with its own identity.
It's very working class. It's very immigrant. And it's actually includes the city's most notorious immigrant slum, which is called 5 Points. So it's working class. It's combative. There's a group associated with it called the Bowery Boys. And the Bowery Boys are these kind of swaggering street toughs. They're kind of pugilistic. They're patriotic. They're defending their turf. And they are enforcers of Tammany Hall, those machine politics that we were talking about. So the Bowery is surrounding Broadway Theater, which is Forrest's home turf. In fact, he got his start in the Bowery Theater, just blocks away from all of this. So these very strong working class associations for Forrest. And then New York's elite decides to build this exclusive velvet roped opera house that nobody else is allowed into, just a few blocks north. And it has those high ticket prices and strict dress codes that we were talking about. So they build this fortress of high culture, cheek by jowl next to the Bowery.
The Bowery is the world that people who have seen the film Gangs of New York might recognize. It is this very poor, working class area where people have a very, very strong sense of community identity. And it's policed, as it were, by these various street gangs, some Catholic, some Protestant, some Irish, some nativist.
Exactly. So it's Gangs of New York, for those who know that film.
And it's exactly the same period. Yeah. I mean, Bill the Butcher is, William Poole is in New York, an infamous figure at exactly this point. Yeah.
He could be going to watch, Ned Forrest, and he probably, he could be involved in the Astor Place riots, right? He would have been
the demographic.
Yeah, exactly. He's right. That's the word I was searching for. Absolutely. It was the target audience.
For a violent disturbance in the theater against the
who
British.
To call. Yeah. So for all of these reasons, New York is a powder keg. And then on May 7th, 1849, McCready is going to open in Macbeth and light the powder keg.
Because Edwin Forrest and his many supporters in New York are going to try to disrupt this performance of Macbeth. They're going to aim to drive McCready off the stage and, if they can, drive him out of the country. But what's going to happen instead is a disaster, a riot that's going to see the military fire upon American civilians and lead to carnage on the streets of New York. Join us next time on Journey Through Time.
See you then.